Hello, everyone. Welcome to our free Lightroom for Nature Photography webinar. Now, nature photography is a really big genre, and we're going to today focus on three things that are part of our upcoming workshop. So I want to tell you guys today that all the things that you're here today and we're going to talk about today will be covered in a lot more detail in our upcoming workshop. So Chrissy and Ugo can put up a link to our upcoming workshop. It is in 48 hours, so it is this Saturday. You can register for one of the classes or all of the workshop classes. If you do register for all the workshop classes, you get 25% off. And we do put on these workshops every couple of months. And we also have free webinars pretty much every month going on. So if you want access to the recording of all the webinars and all the workshops, you can also sign up to our streaming service, which also will put up a link to in the chat box. So as long as you know that, just make sure you can take advantage of this. And we will be covering these topics in a lot more details that you're just about to hear today. All right, so let's talk about some of the challenges with nature photography. One of the biggest challenges with nature photography is you have to travel to take photos like this that you see on my screen. Now, when you're traveling, let's face it, Lightroom, as much as a fantastic program it is not always easy to balance performance, space, and all the things you want to accomplish in Lightroom. So if I were to look at the data that I have at home, I have several terabytes of data. Well, I obviously can't take all that terabytes of data with me when I travel, right? So one of the biggest challenges of Lightroom is how do you balance the performance and the amount of space in your travel and make sure nothing breaks. Now, why is this important? Well, the last time Chrissy and I were out on a workshop, one of the things that we found out was one of the guys called me and saying, hey, what kind of waterfall images do you guys have? Because I want to purchase one. Now, I am in Iceland in some remote location. I need to be able to access my images. Well, if you have a Lightroom catalog and you can't take all your data with you, how do you go about doing that? So having to explain all the nuances that comes with Lightroom catalog is Chrissy Donati. So I'm going to turn it over to Chrissy. So I'll stop my share. And Chrissy, you can take over from here.
Okay. All right, can everybody see my screen? You should be seeing a beautiful photo. Yes?
Yep.
All right. Well, here we go. So like Jay said, Lightroom catalog management, I don't get to talk about, like Jay and Ugo are going to get to talk about like the sexy part of Lightroom. I'm going to talk about the stuff that when you do all of this and hear all of this, you're thankful when something actually goes wrong, and you're thankful that every time you work in Lightroom, it's easy, it's effortless, and it's efficient. So a lot of these things, when I started photography, I didn't really dive into this thing because naturally you just want to edit all your photos. And that's the fun part. But when you actually start to get to those terabyte, 2 terabytes of data, or you're trying to look and combine with the HDR, and you're doing things that take more processing speed, this really becomes integral, and it can make or break you loving Lightroom. So one of the things that is important is to know that Lightroom only has one catalog at a time. And with that said, one of the best practices that I recommend for people is you only need one catalog. A lot of times people would say, oh, I don't want to mix my personal and my professional photos. Lightroom has so many tools and tips and tricks to sort and organize. You can absolutely use one catalog and never see, keep them completely separated. In addition to that, a lot of times people complain, well, if I have too many photos, what happens about the speed? Absolutely used to be true back in the day, but we're no longer running on dial-up internet speed. This can run efficiently if you have all of the right settings. So I can't dive into everything today, but I can give you a lot of high-level topics right now, and we can talk more in depth on Saturday. But one of the things that is big is how you store your images. And this means for the catalog itself, because the catalog is that database of all of the information on your photos, that should be on your internal drive, because that is going to give you the best performance speed. That is what makes Lightroom happy. If you try and move it off, Lightroom will give you a warning. So the moral of this story is don't make Lightroom mad. Keep your internal catalog on your internal hard drive. But for all of your images, the majority of them should actually be stored off of your internal hard drive. So you want them externally, whether that's on a pluggable hard drive, RAID storage, however you want to choose that. Now, the trick is, as you become more proficient in Lightroom, you can have workaround solutions. For example, for all of the photos that I'm taking this year and that I'm keeping with me, that I'm working a lot on, those are actually going to be on my internal hard drive. All of my older photos that I only access every so often, mostly like when clients ask for them, or I need a really throwback of an old travel photo these days for a social media post, that is where all of those are stored externally. So there's different workarounds that you can get. So you're still keeping the performance speed in Lightroom, but you're able to manage everything efficiently and also keep things simple. Now, with the balancing performance speed, Lightroom gives us a ton of options. And there's no one way where I can say, here's the perfect formula, do this. This is where you have to become the chef and make your recipe. And the recipe is based on how many images you have, how often you shoot, how many cameras you have, as well as what your computer limitations are, or if you don't have any computer limitations. So some of these things that you can change are your preview settings. And I can't dive into everything right now, but one thing that you can do is for your standard previews, when you look and go into your settings, you can choose that. And that dictates all of those standard previews within Lightroom, how big, small, how efficient can your system run. The best thing that you can do is take that and set it to your monitor's resolution, because you don't need it bigger than your monitor's resolution because it's just a waste of space. So a lot of times Lightroom can do this automatically, but it's always a good thing to check, because chances are most of the times when I work with people, they don't have this set correctly. And they're basically just wasting their computer CPU power on stuff that they don't need and they're never actually going to use because it's limited by your monitor's resolution. Other things you can look at is file handling preferences on how you send things out to Photoshop or to external editors like Topaz, and also automatically writing things to XMPs. And this is one where a lot of people will say, oh, just check the box. I don't like that. I don't like when someone tells me, trust me, because I don't trust them then. So we can dive down deeper into when it works, when it is best for you to automatically write to XMPs, and what does that really mean? How does that affect the backup to the catalog or the backing up to your images? What is included in those XMP files? Because what happens is the XMP does not have all of the information that is actually stored in your catalog. You still need to back up your catalog and you still need to back up your XMPs, but how do we do this most efficiently? Other things that you can do to affect your performance speed in Lightroom and make sure that everything is just running at the snap of the fingers is look at your different cache settings and the locations of them. That is a huge one that most times when people are getting that spinning wheel of death, that's the first place I check, and chances are it's way too low. And then we have to, maneuver things, and immediately you're going to see a bump in speed. So Lightroom just goes humming along. And then the other thing is optimizing the catalog. Many times I find people, especially if you're using Mac, or I forget what PC calls it, but those automatic backup storages, so like you just set it and forget it. The problem is with that is every time you manually back up Lightroom's catalog, it tests the integrity of the catalog, it optimizes it, and that is what allows Lightroom to continue to function efficiently. So if you just use a time capsule, is that what it's called? I think so. It's not actually getting done. So this is why it's important for you to actually take control and do this yourself. And then one that goes on to that Jay talked about is travel options, because these catalogs tend to be quite large. You have thousands upon thousands of photos. So if you are in Iceland with very little reception and someone calls you and they want to license an image and it's a great opportunity, you need to be able to get to that image, get it to the client on time. Or even if, you know, if my mom calls and she wants an image, I'm going to get her that image, even if I don't have service, because I'm a good daughter. So we can do this, and we can do this smartly, because you don't need to travel with everything under the sun. There's smart ways to do this to make it efficient and also keep it really easy for you. There's also options where if you just want to travel light, you don't even need to take all of your image or catalogs. You just want to be a free spirit. You can do that. And there's best practices on how to travel with an empty catalog. Go do your travel on the plane ride back, or maybe the car ride, I guess I should say. You can catalog, import all your images. You can keyword everything. You can use virtual copies, collections, and I dive down deeper into all of this because it's so much and it's so integrated. I can't really do too much right now because I really need a lot more time to go into all those specifics. But you can get all of that done, and then in 5 clicks, when you get back home, take all of that travel catalog, merge it with your main catalog, and everything is consolidated, and again, in one place, making life simple for you and simple for Lightroom. So the last thing that also I think is great and super important for catalog management is talking about your backup solutions. And this goes into backing up your catalog, your images, because your images aren't stored in Lightroom, as well as all of the extras. Like if you spend a lot of time, which I will recommend and suggest, on keywording and the strategies to keyword and the hierarchies with your keywords. How do you back that up, that should anything come to pass, let's knock on wood, that a hard drive crashes or your computer crashes, whatever happens. I mean, after 2020, weirder things have happened. How do you have everything backed up, in what order, and how much redundancy do you have in that? So you can have everything backed up to your computer on an external hard drive, mirrored, and then to the cloud. And those are plenty of redundancy to give you that. But we need to know the details behind within Lightroom. So what does actually backing up your catalog mean? What does that include and what does that not include? The same thing with when we go back to checking the automatically write XMPs. What is in the XMP files? What is not in the XMP files? Are your keywords contained? All of this you need to look at and lay out to make sure that if anything, God forbid, happens, you can get all of your images back, your catalog back, and in 20 minutes be up and running again. So that is kind of some high level on catalog management and best practices and things that I recommend on how to balance between the performance, speed, and your hard drive space so you can really make the most out of your Lightroom. But with that, when you're getting the most efficient and the best performance, then you get to have all the fun that Jay and Ugo are going to talk about now with how do you make those images just jaw-droppingly beautiful. All right, I'm going to stop my screen share.
All right, so let's talk about the next phase of processing in Lightroom. All right, but before I go there, I have to tell you guys a story. Is about 4 weeks ago, one of my hard drives crashed, and I have a RAID system, so I could still operate the hard drive, but in order to replace it, I had to actually download the backup from the cloud server that I back up everything from. And one of the things that got destroyed in it is the catalog in Lightroom. Now, my catalog in Lightroom isn't very big because a lot of my images are with Bridge and I use Photoshop a lot. But I still have few images in Lightroom and some catalog management I do. And without that backup, I could tell you that I would have lost everything in Lightroom. So one of the things that we are going to cover in Chris's class is fairly detailed backup strategies and why you need to follow it and why it's good for you, among several other things. All right. So my presentation today, let's talk about the next presentation up, is going to be about creative sharpening. So let me ask you guys a question. How many sharpening tools are there in Lightroom? Can somebody give me a number? Let's see. What do you guys think, right? We have about 178 people online right now. How many sharpening tools are there in Lightroom?
Is this the Price is Right rules?
Lightroom. 12, that's a good number. 25. All right, now somebody's just pulling things off left and right. 6. 3. Now that is a great answer. They're actually 3 is closer to a real answer. There are actually 4 sharpening tools in Lightroom. And let's take a look at how to use that and see if I can actually try to impress you with maybe a little bit of my knowledge. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and it will tell me when you see this. So let's start with the presentation. So can you guys see my screen?
Yep. Coming up.
All right, so I'm going to go full screen, and this session is going to be on creative sharpening. Now, before we get into tools of sharpening in Lightroom, let me explain what sharpening is and see if I can change some opinions or maybe give you guys a new perspective on sharpening, right? So sharpening, when people talk about sharpening, they always look at sharpening as restoring details in the edges. So sharpening in simplest form looks like this. So the top image that you see on the right over here is what comes out of your computer camera. The edges are just slightly blurred, and there are a number of reasons for that blur to occur. And some of them are lenses, and some of them are equipment related. Others are related to natural factors. But if your photo is focused correctly, and if you're using good quality equipment, you'll have that blur minimized. Now, ideally, you want the edge to be what you see in the middle, right? You want a sharp edge as much as possible. Now, when we try to sharpen, a lot of times we end up over sharpening, and that is what you see at the bottom. Now, over sharpening means you get halos around the edges, and this just looks really terrible. I've seen lots of photos on social media with that over sharpening in, and you really don't want that. So your goal for sharpening your edges is going to be going from the top to the middle and to avoid producing halos, okay? Now, this is the ideal and the simplest view of sharpening, right? So now let's go to the next slide. Now, in real life, the edge that I showed you is a very small portion of the image. So if you're looking at this waterfall from Iceland, this edge is just where the mountain meets the sky. That is your sharpest edge that you talk about. But then you have details, like you have textures in the clouds, right? How do you sharpen those? Then you have a completely different set of details or textures in the rocks, which is in the yellow rectangle. How do you sharpen those? And then you have textures that are in the flowing water. So what are the tools that you use to sharpen all those in Lightroom, right? And yes, Lightroom does provide tools to sharpen every one of these edges and textures and details. So what creative sharpening is a workflow to sharpen not only your edges, but also your details and textures that you see in your photos. So when most professional photographers look at sharpening, they think about sharpening in 3 different aspects. They think about capture sharpening, creative sharpening, and output sharpening. So capture sharpening is to get over the blur that is introduced by your camera equipment. So your camera sensor most of the time has a infrared filter that will slightly blur the image. Also, the way the pixels are arranged in the camera has to, what comes out of the camera has to go through bare layer interpolation, and then that also introduces a slight amount of blur. Your lens's imperfection may introduce a slight amount of blur. So that is, to get that blur out is what we call capture sharpening. Now, creative sharpening is introduced by all other elements. They're introduced by factors that are outside your control. Natural factors. So for example, this image in Glacier, you notice that there is a really sharp mountain edge right below where the sun is setting, right? Now, so when you look at this photo, you want that edge to be super sharp, right? But then rest of the photo under that edge is just a haze or sunbeams coming up, and it has like created a low contrast film on top of everything. So you don't want to lose that, because that is what gives you the sunbeam effect. So you need to be able to sharpen parts of your images differently than other parts of your images. Now, if you look at a cloud in this clouds in this image, I want the textures in the clouds to come out. And then if you look at the foreground, there's a ton of detail in the foreground. So I want all those details in the foreground to come out. So you need to use different sharpening techniques for different parts of the image. And that is what the creative sharpening is all about, right? And the output sharpening is when you compress this image and put it up for web, you need some more sharpening to make sure that it doesn't look blurry on Facebook or too sharp on Facebook or Instagram or whatever your favorite social media is, or even on your screen. And that type of sharpening is called output sharpening. So the workshop class that I'm going to talk about is going to focus on the first two aspects. We're going to talk about capture sharpening a little bit, and we're going to focus majority of the class on creative sharpening, because that is where the magic happens. Capture sharpening will depend on your equipment, and you can only do so much. But creative sharpening will transform your ordinary images to something that will make everybody say, wow. All right. So a few other things. So what impacts sharpness? Like I talked about some of these things on in my previous slide, right? So there's image capture and equipment that will impact your sharpness. And then there's natural factors that will impact your sharpness. So in our presentation, we'll go over details of how some of this will impact. But let me give you a small example of how the natural factors impact the sharpness. Here are the two images taken on the same day at the same place. Now, the difference between these two images is obviously light, right? So as the sun was going down, there was a small opening on the horizon, and the light is streaming through in the image on the right. Now, if you look at the image on the right, you can see superb amount of textures in the sand, right? They're very well defined. And if actually I were to zoom into the big image, you can actually see the grains of the sand individually. Now, if you see the image on the left, the same white sand that is there is the textures are not quite as well defined, right? So the light has impacted the details in the image that you see. Now, sometimes you don't want to restore the details, but in other times, you may want to restore the details. So creative sharpening is to be able to restore the details that you see in the image. Now, even in this photo that is by Verena Patel on the left side, she has actually done sharpening to be able to see the textures, which are white on white textures that you see in her image, all right? So let's go a little more deeper, and I'm going to give you guys a demo as to what we're going to cover in the upcoming class and how this transforms, all right? So I'm going to escape out of, let's see. I will start a new share, and this time I'm going to go into Lightroom. Can you guys see my Lightroom screen, everybody?
Yep.
We'll go, all right. So let's start our demo with this. So this is what my camera captured. This is a phenomenal place. It's in Mývatn, Iceland. And if you look at this image, notice that the light will affect the perceived sharpness of the image. So what kind of light we're talking about? Well, this is a sort of a backlit and side-lit image. And this image was captured before the sun had come up over the horizon. So let's take a look at the foreground. So my foreground, when you look at the foreground, it is completely in shade. So there is no side lighting, so to speak of, at least not the direct side lighting that you saw in New Mexico. So when you look at this image over here, and as you move around, there are textures there, but they don't look very pronounced, right? The way the textures of this image should look is like this. This is what you should see in your image when you process it. This is what the power of creative sharpness is all about, right? So this is what the camera captures, and this is what you want to get to. Now, so how did I get there? Well, let me explain a little more as to what other type of sharpening is there before we get into a question of how did I get there, all right? So I'm going to go to default setting. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the entire image. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about in the class is if you want to produce images like that, you need to be able to analyze your image with respect to different elements that are present, right? So in this case, I'm going to start to maybe annotate my image. So see if I can annotate. All right. So in this case, I can break down this image into 3 different types of areas that will require 3 different types of sharpening. All right. So one area is this area. This is all clouds. And what you want to do is you want to be able to see the textures in the cloud, and you want to be able to preserve the colors. All right. So that's one area. So let's clear this. All right. The other area is this mid-tone area, right? So this mid-tone area has very different sharpening requirements. Mid-tone area has haze because of the smoke that is going in. But then if you were to zoom in to this mid-tone area, there's also textures that are right here. Plus, it has this sharp edge that is going all the way across the entire image, okay? So that requires a different type of sharpening. And then let me clear all of this again. The other area is this foreground area. Well, this foreground area, if you notice, has a couple of things. One is it has exposure problems. It is a little bit darker than I like. But the entire foreground area and the midground area is in shade. Right now, there's no light falling on it. So when I zoomed in to that, remember the midground area looked really flat. You couldn't see the grains of the sand that you should be able to see or were able to see when you were at the location. So let me show you guys how I did the sharpening. So I broke the sharpening up. Let's clear this annotation so you guys can see properly. All right, so I broke this sharpening up into 2 parts, capture sharpening and also creative sharpening. So first thing I did was I did the capture sharpening. So I changed the color balance and I did capture sharpening. What capture sharpening did was actually allowed me to go into my edge and make it nice and sharp. So I removed chromatic aberrations. I made sure that my edges over here, which has slight softness to it, I was able to get rid of it by just going to capture sharpening. Now we're going to go over detailed setting of exactly how I change my basic sliders and things in the class above. So that is where I ended up with capture sharpening. But look at this image in the foreground. This foreground image, it's a little bit darker and it has a little bit more details than our default image, but it is not there yet, right? It can use a little more textures to it. So the next thing I did was I did sharpening for the sky. So I used particular tools in the Lightroom to sharpen the sky. So here we go. So this was my original image, and you can see, and this is what I did for textures in the sky. So if I were to zoom in, you can see all the textures that were lost and they were flat now has really more textures defined. Now, remember, sky itself and the clouds don't have any sharp boundaries. So your traditional sharpening in details panel won't work here. You have to adopt a different approach. So after I did the sharpening for the sky, I said, all right, let's go ahead and tackle the foreground. Now in foreground, when I made all those adjustments, it made the foreground really dark. So I had to do two things. I had to restore, first of all, the foreground luminosity, and then I had to sharpen. So here I ended up sharpening the foreground and restoring the luminosity. So if you guys could see this, this is the detail in the foreground. So I started off with this and I ended up over here. Now, watch what happens. I'm going to zoom out. Now, when I sharpened for the sky, it didn't affect the foreground. Foreground remained the same. When I sharpened the foreground, it didn't affect the sky. It remained the same. So we're using different sharpening techniques in different parts of the image. Then finally, you want to sharpen the midground and restore the brightness of the midground. So here is where I sharpen the midground and restore the brightness. Now let's take a look. When I did restore the sharpen and restore the brightness of the midground, nothing else got affected, correct? You also notice that, hey, the mood of the image, the haze, everything is preserved. Nothing is lost here, right? So, and then you can finish off the image by putting in some small tweaks if you have to. For this particular image, I didn't really need a whole lot of tweaks, so I just left it as is. Now, people said, well, how did you end up getting from this to this? Well, there are 4 primary sharpening tools that I use. So let me go back to my presentation. So I'll stop the share. I'll do a new share, actually. All right, so let's see. Oops. All right, so all right, so can you guys see this?
Yep. Well, I'm back to a demo slide from Iceland.
Yeah. So there are 4 primary tools that Lightroom gives you for sharpening: detail, smell, textures, clarity, and dehaze. And then there are a bunch of secondary tools. Now, the problem is these primary tools and secondary tools interact with one another. So you can use textures as much as you want, but if you don't have your exposure or your highlight or shadows correct, then textures won't work. It won't do anything. So what we're going to talk about in our class is, what is this interaction all about, and how do you know which tools to target for which areas? All right, let me give you another demo. So here, we talked about this demo, right? So let me show you. I won't go over the details of this, but I wanted to show you guys the possibilities of what you can do. So I'll go back to my Lightroom. All right, so all of this particular image is what we're going to cover in detail in the class that is coming up on Saturday. The second image is also what we're going to cover. So here's what I captured in my camera. This is a fantastic location, and the lighting was just perfect. And this is my finished image. Now, let's take a look at all the sharpening that you guys see in the image. So this is some of the details that you can see, and this is the default. You can see how soft it is. The textures, even the edges of the rocks, the basalt columns are pretty soft, right? The finished image should be crisp, and everything should be detailed and defined, right? All right, let's take a look at this. This is a flow of water that I had used shutter speed to capture, right? Default image, there is nothing. It's just completely wiped out, right? Because of the exposure balancing that I had to do. And with the proper sharpening techniques, you should be able to see the flow lines in every part of the waterfall. All right, so that, it went from here, look at the water, to here. The same thing with clouds, right? there is very subtle textures of the cloud. It is all kind of just blended in because it was heavily overcast day. And then in the finished image, you can see a lot more textures. The colors are restored. These smoke clouds that are hanging out at the bottom had a ton of textures in it. You can notice, you can zoom into every part of the image and you'll be able to see the textures and the details. This is the power of creative sharpening. Now, if you were to just go ahead and use saying, oh, I'm just going to restore the balance using just the detail panel, because that's what a lot of people think sharpening is, this is what you end up. This is the use of detail panel and some color adjustments. By going with creative sharpness, you end up over here. So that is the power of the creative sharpness. So one other example of why the creative sharpness works and why you need it is, you know, as landscape photographers, we always love high dynamic range photos where the beams of light are shooting down and you guys are all excited running around trying to capture that. And then you get home and you say, I'm going to put an HDR together, or you fire up Lightroom or any of your favorite plugins and try to put an HDR together, and the HDR looks like this. Now, why is it? Well, what HDR does is it balances out the lights in different parts of the image. So what it has done is it is trying to balance out the light in highlights. It's trying to balance out the lights over here in the shadows. So when you actually, if I were to look at a bracketed shot, my bracketed shot for the highlights looks like this. And my bracketed shot for the shadows, which is at the bottom, looks like this as well. But when you put everything together, it just merges everything and it creates a flat 32-bit image in Lightroom, right? So you can use a number of different techniques, sharpening techniques, filters, range masks, shadows, highlights, adjustments, to go from an HDR image to something that just makes your mom want to buy every print you produce. Okay, now that part of the talk is going to be led by Ugo Che. So I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ugo Che, and I'm going to say that if you guys are interested in learning about creative sharpness, hope some of you will join me on Saturday. And one thing that I do want to mention, that all our workshops and online classes that we do, if you can make it, as long as you're registered, we do the class, we do the recording, and then we'll send out the recording to you. You have 1 year to access the recording. So if you can't make it, don't worry about it. It'll be recorded and available to you. All right, Ugo, it's yours. I'm going to stop my video.
Thank you, Jay. Can you see my introduction slide?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, as you said it correctly, HDR can be a way to at least increase or improve perceived sharpness or perceived detail in a photo. So let's talk a little bit about definition. What is HDR, or high dynamic range? An HDR image is an image that spans a range of brightness values that are larger than what the camera can capture. And please forgive me if I'm going to talk for 1 minute about the zone system. I'm not going to give you all the theory about the zone system. You can almost ignore it, but the zone system is about placing different parts of the scene into different zones, as Ansel Adams would call them. And zones correspond to various amounts of detail. Zone 0 is pure black with no detail. Zone 1 is very dark black with just a little bit of texture. Likewise, zone 10 is pure white, absolutely no detail. And zone 9 is, you just see a little bit of texture. And then everything in between has more detail, more texture. The zone system was invented for film, for printing, and so on, but it still applies when we talk about the dynamic range of images, because the zone system for film and print has 10 zones. Everything that is in zone 0 or zone 10 is basically just flat black or complete white. There's no detail. We don't want that. Typically, we want some amount of detail or texture almost everywhere in a photo. So when our photos exceed what is the dynamic range, the number of zones that our digital sensors can capture, then we end into problems, and we can use HDR to fix those problems. So we might find ourselves in a situation like this one where I love shooting into the sun. And so I find myself often in those situations where if I want to expose for the shadows here, like the town there and a bit of even if trying to expose for the shadows here, everything that is in the shade is very dark, but the sky is overblown. Or I can expose for the sky and then everything else is pretty pitch black. Our eyes, conversely, can look at this scene and make out detail everywhere. They're not limited as our cameras are. Here's another example, right? Our eyes, I was there, I can remember with my eyes that I could see color in the sky, and I could see detail and color beneath the roof of that pagoda, right? There was red color there, but the camera was not able to capture the color in the sky and the color of the building at the same time. It was just too limited in the number of stops or number of zones that it could capture. So in a situation like this, I always end up bracketing my shots. In this situation, I think I bracketed from -2, -1, 0, +1, +2 even. Because when I'm shooting into the sun and I have some areas in the shade, even with a modern camera that has a lot of dynamic range, from -1 to +1, sometimes it's not enough. So in the end, this is what I want to get out of that scene. It's something that reminds me what my eyes could see. And it's still something that to me looks mostly natural. It's plausible, right? You would not, maybe for this one, there's a lot of recovering the shadows here, but I do a lot of HDR where you might find it hard to guess if whether it's HDR or not. This is my approach, make it look natural. And this is what I'm going to teach you in my course on Saturdays. So see, people are drawing in the screen. So there are many ways that you can go about doing HDR, but our seminar here is about Lightroom, and Lightroom is a great tool for doing HDR. There are other tools. It's possibly not the best tool out there, but there is one reason that I believe HDR to me is my solution of choice in most cases, and it is 32-bit DNG files. This is what makes it worthwhile. What are 32-bit DNG files? These are, when you do HDR in Lightroom, it creates those files with a DNG extension, and they have 32 bits per pixel. It means they have the double the dynamic range of normal RAW files, potentially double. Let's put it like that to simplify. So this allows for a much smoother gradation of tones. In theory, with a 16-bit RAW file, you can have up to about 65,000 levels of gray or color shades. If you go up to 32 bits, you have more than 4 billion different levels, different shades. That's a huge number of zones in Ansel Adams' zone system. Now you might say, well, I don't really need 4 billion levels. I don't even need 65,000. That's more than our eyes can actually perceive. Our eyes are not able to distinguish between 65,000 different shades of gray. But why do we want that? It is because, as Jay was saying before, what you get out of the HDR process initially is quite flat. You want to work on that image, on that DNG file, to bring out all the color, the tone gradations, the details, the sharpness, the texture that are there. And for that, you need to work on your photos, and you want to do so that they preserve all the information that is there, right? So you want those files to be, DNG file to be as malleable, is that a word in English, as normal RAW files, so you're able to not introduce too many artifacts. So maintain the quality of the files from processing, and having so many more shades of gray or color allows you to do that without bumping into limits when you start moving your sliders left and right. And the other thing is that DNG files, with respect to other tools, where you do your HDR process, you do your tone mapping process, and you apply presets, what you get out of it is essentially baked in. It's like a JPEG image. Right? It has much more detail, it can be a TIFF file, but essentially the process that you do there is baked in. When you do HDR with the Lightroom process, what you get is another raw file. It means you can still do your normal workflow, right? When you bring your raw files into Lightroom, if they're not HDR, you would normally go and set your white balance, tint, shadows, blacks, whites. You can apply a camera profile. When you do it on a 32-bit DNG file, it's still a raw file, so you can still do all of those things like you would with a normal file. The color profile is not baked in. You can change color profile, camera profile at any time, white balance, whatever. So let me show you just a quick video where I'm going to demonstrate how to do in practice for those who don't know HDR in Lightroom. Let me see if I can give you a share. Stop this one. Okay, it's actually not. All right, 1 second. It is QuickTime. One sec. Share. Share. Oh, there it is. I don't know why. Stupid Zoom was not showing it. Full screen. Okay, can you see it? Let's look at a simple example of HDR processing. These 3 photos were taken at -2, 0, and +2 EV respectively, because they were shot against the sun, so there was a lot of contrast in the scene. Let's look at the EXIF data for these just to understand what I mean here. This is the darkest one and was taken at 1/60th of a second, f16, ISO 100. This other one was taken 2 stops brighter, that is 4 times the slower shutter speed at 1/15th of a second. And this one was taken 2 stops brighter again, that is 4 times slower shutter speed again at 1/4 of a second. Once we have selected those 3 photos, it's very easy to create an HDR 32-bit DNG image. We simply have to go to the photo menu and click Photo Merge HDR. This will bring up the preview window, and after a few seconds, Lightroom will generate a preview of our HDR image. Here is the preview, and as you can see, it's very dark and a lot of contrast still, but this is just a preview with no processing applied, and as we will see, there's a lot that we can bring out of this photo. But first, let's look at the controls that we have at our disposal in this preview window. From the top, we have the Auto Align checkbox. I normally keep this always on, even if I'm shooting on a tripod, because for whatever reason the camera might move between shots, maybe because there was some wind or I bump into the camera inadvertently. So it's better to just keep it on. It doesn't hurt, even if the photos were taken on a very stable tripod. You can also check the auto settings. I normally don't do it. This will be the same as going to develop module and clicking
your
on auto.
video is covered up by some windows.
The other thing that you can do is choose your deghost amount. This is where Lightroom will try to figure out what elements of the photo have windows, like what? Like the zoom windows?
Yes, the zoom windows.
Let me try again.
One at the bottom as well. All right.
Now still there.
Still see one at the very bottom there.
I think Zoom is playing. Oh, well, I hope it's not this. I mean,
it's not bad.
Yeah, okay. There's nothing there that you actually need to see. So
shots, and then try to get the best representation of those elements without any ghosting. This can happen in a situation like this if there is wind and the clouds are moving fast, or if you have vegetation and again it's windy. You can see if you click on the Show the Ghost Overlay checkbox, the preview window will show red areas where it has identified some moving items. But actually, as you can see here, even if I set the deghost amount to high, there is no ghosting at all. So we can just proceed with this. Otherwise, I might want to check how it looks with different settings. The final element is Create Stack. You can use that if you want to stack your resulting HDR image together with the original shots. Let's click on Merge and see what Lightroom does. Now Lightroom is merging those 3 photos to an HDR image. And while it is doing so, the task is running in the background, which means that I can do other things if I want on other pictures. Or I can wait patiently for it to finish, which we are going to do right now because it's going to be very fast. Now Lightroom has created the HDR image, which is not shown here because I was selecting one of the original shots, but I can go back to the library view, and then here is my HDR. As you can see, it's still pretty dark. There's still a lot of contrast here. Let's go into the develop module to see how much detail we can bring out of this. One thing that you might notice as you go into the develop module is that with 32-bit HDR images, the range of the basic sliders like exposure, highlights, shadows, and whites has been extended. And while for normal 16-bit files, it goes from -50 to +50, with 32-bit HDR images, it goes from -100 to +100. And actually, you can see that the shadow slider, you can bring it up all the way to 100 and bring out a lot of the shadows there, the detail in the shadows. Because of the nature of HDR, you can typically apply much larger adjustments to the tones than you would normally do to a single shot, and this without creating a lot of nasty artifacts. In this case, I still need a bit more brightness in the shadows, so I'm going to bring up the exposure a little bit, and the sky has become pretty bright now, but I can tame that by using the highlight slider and taking that down quite a bit. And as you can see, there's a lot of detail there that was a bit washed out when I had my highlights at 0. Now, maybe this is a bit extreme, going to -100 to +100, but this is just to show you what you can do, not what you necessarily should do with this type of image. I'm also going to fix the black point and the white point by typing the Alt key and then sliding the blacks to the right until I start seeing some black bits, and also with the whites. Right, so this makes sure that my image is making use of all the dynamic range contained in the HDR file. Not a lot of color here, so you might want to increase the brightness to bring out some of that. Maybe shift the tint just a little bit to bring out some of the pink color of those rocks. Not too much. Warm it up a little bit, because this was sun low on the horizon. The colors tend to be warm. We want to see that. Maybe it's a bit flat. You want to give it a little contrast curve. And I like to use some texture, especially when you have rocks in the picture. This brings out some of the details. It's more apparent if you blow up the image large. You might also want to use clarity. And let's see what clarity does. With HDR images, it's easy to go overboard with clarity and get too much of that HDR look, which doesn't look very natural to me, especially in the sky. So you might want to bring that back and only add a little bit of clarity to make it more subtle. Now, this can be a good starting point. This is definitely not everything that we can get out of this photo. There's much more that we can do with selective adjustments. This is just to give you an idea of how much information we can get out of those 32-bit HDR DNG files.
Okay, sorry about the overlays. I don't know what Zoom is doing today. I'm just going to finish a couple more minutes to finish my presentation. Okay, there you are. Hope you can see it. So another important part of, can you see it clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. Another important part of HDR, at least the way I do it, is you need to get it right in camera or set yourself up for success by using the right practices in the field in order to ensure that what you bring home and then you start doing the HDR process is actually useful. Right, so I'm just going, this is just a list of the things that I normally do or keep in mind. We have no time today to talk about them in detail. I invite you to our more detailed workshop on Saturday about those, but yeah, keep that in mind that you need to start getting it right in the field. Finally, again, make it look natural. It's easy to go overboard. When HDR started being popular, this kind of style was very crunchy, very colorful, a lot of clarity in there, was very popular, but it kind of faded out. Luckily, it faded out of favor with the public. And nowadays, this is the kind of, I mean, you probably, if you didn't know this was HDR, you might not be able to even tell, but yeah, this was HDR. So yeah, this concludes my presentation. Thanks for your attention. Jay, do you want to?
Yes, I just wanted to say, hey, this is end of our presentation. I hope you like what we saw. And if you want to learn more about this, please join us on Saturday. Yeah, we'd love to see you guys, some of them, some or more of you in there. If you guys have any questions, we'll hang out over here for a few minutes and hope to answer the questions. So let's see. There was a question about HDR. Is LR the only HDR program that outputs 32-bit files? As far as I know, I don't know any other program that works with 32-bit files, but I have not used all of them, so I can't tell you. Okay, so people who do want to join on Saturday, I am going to put a link on, and you guys can go ahead and subscribe to that link, subscribe to the class. Remember, if you subscribe to all of them, you will probably get a discount. Just use the red button to subscribe to all of them, and you can get 20% off. All right, any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I need to go. We have a family dinner tonight.
All right,
they're
see you
waiting
guys.
for me up there.
I'll take care of your.
I'll see you on Saturday. Have a good day.
So from a perspective of, so all the content you see on Visual Wilderness right now is available to subscribers. And we have another Photoshop workshop that we're planning in April, I think, and that is available. And anything else that we do for the rest of the year will be available. Anything we have done last year, the year before, all the tutorials will be available. So Chrissy, can you put in your link for the how to become a subscriber? So for subscribers, even if you were not to make it to today's presentation, we'll send this free presentation out to you guys, and you can watch it whenever. All right, so that's what subscription gets you. You can also get, so last year we put on probably about 25 or different classes, ranging from luminosity mask, flower photography, and everything in between, colors, light. So you could go from there. So let me see if I can have Chrissy put on her how to become a subscriber link. So look for more presentations. We do these free things. So the subscription cost is $14.95 per month, but it is on annual plan. If you guys want to subscribe to monthly plan, we do charge very high fee for the first month, because what people do with monthly plan is they watch a ton of videos, and it gets into our bandwidth constraints. So if you want to do that, go ahead. You can sign up for monthly plan. We do have some people on monthly plan, but after the first month, your monthly plan drops down to $29 per month. 80% of our subscribers are on annual plans. So just letting you guys know. All right. Thank you very much for taking time and being with us. Hopefully we'll see you guys again.
Yeah. Take care.